you. I see more people coming in. Welcome to Words Writers and Southwest Stories. This is Dora Fay, and we'll get back to you in a few minutes with our program tonight, Humanity in Print, Literature and Human Rights.
Well, okay. Well, I will go ahead and welcome everybody to the program. And I know we have some other folks registered that are coming in, and I will be monitoring my emails to make sure that everybody gets a chance to participate tonight. So welcome everybody to our September Words Writers Southwest Stories program. We're really glad to be back this fall. I'm Elizabeth Rudrud, and I'm the programs director with the Southwest Seattle Historical Society. And our organization that operates out of the Log House Museum up at Alki Beach has a mission to promote local history through education, preservation, and advocacy. Our Words Writers and Southwest Story program brings historians, authors, and community voices to our audiences. I just wanted to do a shout out here for everybody in the audience. If you have recommendations for a speaker for the series, we'd be just more than pleased to hear from you. And you can email us those recommendations at museum@loghousemuseum.org. The presentation you are about to enjoy tonight is supported by the Humanities Washington Speakers Bureau program. Humanities Washington is a nonprofit organization dedicated to sparking conversation and critical thinking, and it provides many other cultural programs to hundreds of thousands of people throughout Washington each year. And we couldn't be more thrilled with our partnership with Humanities Washington to bring these speakers to you. And with that, I would like to pass this along to Dora Fay, who is the chair of Words Writers Southwest Stories, and she will introduce our speaker.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for being here. I think we're going to learn something tonight. We're very pleased to welcome our guest from Walla Walla, Dr. Richard Middleton-Kaplan. And the introduction is a little bit different, but I like the approach. So we usually don't extend human rights to people who don't see as fully human. So how do we develop empathy for those we view as alien or inhuman? One way is through literature, which takes us inside the lives and actions of others. By instilling empathy and by giving voice to cries for justice, literature forms the foundation for human rights. Professor Richard Middleton-Kaplan shares stories about human rights activists he has encountered throughout his academic career. What these activists endured was shocking, yet they found meaning and beauty in literature, and so can we. In his talk, Humanity in Print, Literature and Human Rights, Professor Kaplan will discuss the literary works that illuminate how to respond to those around us who have suffered human rights violations and those who have committed incomprehensible acts. These works can even help us to make sense of the wrongs that we ourselves have endured. Kaplan is a former Dean of Arts and Sciences at Walla Walla Community College. In 2011, he spent a sabbatical at the Center for Applied Human Rights at the University of York, helping to develop a course on literature and human rights. His publications include Using Literature to Teach Peace in Peace Research, the Canadian Journal of Peace and Conflict Studies. Middleton-Kaplan lives in Walla Walla. Welcome to Words Writers and the Southwest Stories, Professor Kaplan. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Dorothy and Elizabeth, for that lovely introduction. Thanks to Southwest Seattle Historical Society. Thanks to Humanities Washington. And thanks to all of you for coming tonight. I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes. Please put your questions in the chat, and then we'll have at least 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. It's very nice to meet all of you, and I hope we have a stimulating evening together. Excuse me. So here's a brief outline. I'm going to talk about empathy as the common foundation of both the modern European novel and the modern European human rights movement. And we'll look at a couple of stories that do exactly what was just described by Dora Fay. We'll look at Sandra Cisneros' short story, Woman Hollering Creek, and then we'll look at Louise Erdrich's novel, The Night Watchman, which won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction a couple of years ago. Then we'll take a look at the way that confronting human rights challenges has led writers and artists to experiment with forms beyond traditional genres, trying to find something that contains the extremity of experience, which may not be already existing forms. And we'll look at graphic novels as one example of that, and then we'll end with a creative collective response to evil, Linda Elia's book of illustrations called Our Struggle. So just to start with, here is a quotation from the contemporary US pragmatist philosopher Richard Rorty, who said, "We pragmatists argue from the fact that the emergence of human rights culture seems to owe nothing to increased moral knowledge and everything to hearing sad and sentimental stories." So in other words, it's not as though humanity is gradually and continuously progressing morally, and that's why we have a modern human rights movement. It's because of the way we're affected by sad and sentimental stories that move us to empathy, that we can attribute an emergence of human rights culture. That's just one example. You can find other statements by that from the poet Seamus Heaney and many other people. One famous example of this in our country is Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is a novel by Harriet Beecher Stowe that did a lot to move sentiment in the North against slavery. And it did it by telling a sad and sentimental story. In the right there, you have an illustration from a contemporary printing of the novel, and you see the deathbed scene of little Eva. That's Uncle Tom at the foot of the bed, and you can see what a kind of overwrought sentimental scene this is. But of course, that was part of that novel's power, its ability to move people, help them see that slaves did in fact have feelings and were not savages or subhuman creatures, but had feelings like others. And then once you recognize other people as human, you can then begin to think about them in empathetic terms, and you can then begin to think about them as deserving human rights. This novel had such a great input that there's a bit of legend in the Harriet Beecher Stowe family lore. I'm not sure if it's true or not, but the legend is that when Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe, he said, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war." That's how great the impact was. There's a statue of them in Hartford commemorating that conversation. This argument about the link between the contemporaneous rise of the modern European novel and the modern human rights movement is made in a book by a woman called Lynn Hunt called Inventing Human Rights, in which she says those two things came up at the same moment. And so at around the time in the 1770s that we're developing our Declaration of Independence, 1790s, when France is developing the Declaration of Rights and Citizens, you also have early novels that are from the point of view and taking us inside the experience of valets, butlers, maids, street urchins, pickpockets, kind of the lower classes with whom aristocratic readers might have had nothing to do and might not even see as human. Alexis de Tocqueville, the great chronicler of America, tells a story of an aristocratic woman who did not hesitate to undress in front of her valet because she didn't think of her valet as human. It was no different from getting undressed in front of a table or a chair. So it was by taking us inside the experiences, showing us the internal lives, developing empathy for those kinds of characters that enabled aristocratic readers start to see those people in the lower social classes as human and therefore as worthy of being included in rights. So Lynn Hunt says, novels made the point that all people are fundamentally similar because of their inner feelings. Reading novels created a sense of equality and empathy through passionate involvement in the narrative. So with that, let's take a look at Sandra Cisneros' story, Woman Hollering Creek. This is a story in a 1991 collection by the same name about a woman named Cleofilas, who is raised in Mexico and is married to a man who takes her across the border into the United States and separates her from her family. And Cleofilas has devoted a lot of her life to watching telenovelas on TV and to reading novel romances, and her expectations of what life should be like are drawn from those. And she expects her life to conform to it, and neither her husband nor her life does conform. Here's an excerpt from the story. But what Cleofilas has been waiting for is passion, not the kind on the cover of the Alarma magazines, the kind the books and songs and telenovelas describe when one finds finally the great love of one's life and does whatever one must do at whatever the cost. So this is her romantic expectation. Of course, her life turns out to be very different. And then we hit this passage. The first time, she was so surprised she didn't cry out or try to defend herself. She had always said she would strike back if a man, any man, were to strike her. And you see what Cisneros does here so brilliantly in the way that she's introduced this is the first time she was so surprised. Cisneros doesn't tell us the first time what. You only know at the end of the passage, it's the first time her husband hit her. But when you're reading the first time she was so surprised, and as a reader, you're asking the first time what, it puts us as readers in the same situation of surprise as Cleofilas herself is. So in terms of building empathy with a woman who suffered domestic abuse, it's taking us inside her surprise and her inability to react, and the way that she doesn't react in the way she's always told herself she would. So in terms of building empathy, if you were to pass, let's say, an abused Mexican-American woman on the street who had not left her husband, would you understand? Would you have instant empathy for her? Would you understand what the thought process was? By writing this in this way, the first time she was so surprised, and we're trying to figure out what's happened ourselves as readers, we're right in that position with her. But when the moment came, when that first time came, and he slapped her once, and then again, and again, until the lip split and bled an orchid of blood, she didn't fight back. She didn't break into tears. She didn't run away as she imagined she might when she saw such things in the telenovelas. She's been conditioned by those telenovelas to expect how she's going to react. She herself can't understand why she hasn't reacted the way that she's been conditioned to. Maybe we've been conditioned by some of those same expectations and have the same question, but now we're seeing it from inside her point of view. And then another instance occurs. He had thrown a book, hers, from across the room, a hot welt across the cheek. She could forgive that. But what stung more was the fact that it was her book, a love story by Corinne Tellado, what she loved most now that she lived in the US without a television set, without the telenovelas. Well, this abuse goes on, and Cleophilus becomes pregnant again, and she manages to convince her husband to let her go to a prenatal appointment. He really doesn't want her to do that. He's suspicious of her getting outside the house. He doesn't think it's worth the money, but she goes, and she manages to persuade him. And while there, she meets a nurse who recognizes the signs of physical abuse on her and phones into a kind of network of women who help abused patients get back across the border to their families. And the name of that person who comes to pick up Cleophilus at the prenatal clinic and take her back to Mexico is a woman named Felice, whose name means happiness. And Felice is unlike any woman that Cleophilus has ever met. She drives a truck. It's her own truck. Curses, she laughs in this wild, raucous laugh. And so Felice picks up Cleophilus and is driving her back. And as they're talking, they cross the creek that's the name of the story, Woman Hollering Creek. It's just the name of this local creek. But Cleophilus has always thought it's named because of a woman who was screaming, hollering in agony, or some kind of suffering. But as they drive across it and they're talking about the name, and they start laughing about the name, then Felice began laughing again. But it wasn't Felice laughing. It was gurgling out of her own throat, a long ribbon of laughter like water. We slowly realize, again, as Cleophilus herself does, that this long ribbon of laughter that she's hearing is spooling not out of Felice, this outrageous character who's unlike any woman Cleophilus has ever met, but out of Cleophilus herself. In other words, her own sense of joy, her own sense that you could holler with joy or happiness, you could laugh, that water could come back, that there would be life, comes into her, and it only slowly dawns on her. So again, in terms of building our empathy by somebody that we might not look at or understand fully from the outside, this story takes us in and is certainly dealing with a human rights issue. So that's one example. Now I want to move to a novel that broadens out even further and looks at when human rights intersect with land rights, or what we might call environmental justice. And perhaps at the end, we could talk about what examples you're experiencing in your area right now where these issues intersect. So the novel I want to talk about is called The Night Watchman by the Native American writer Louise Erdrich from the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa or Ojibwe in Minnesota. In this novel, which is based on, to some extent, a real story, the narrator is a young woman, and she is in the 1950s at a time where an actual U.S. congressman proposed legislation that would disestablish all Native American tribes, and would do so on the grounds that they had become economically self-sufficient and no longer needed to be supported by the government. And what they should do is move to cities, assimilate into American society and the American economy. And so they would receive a small individual payment, and in return, their rights would, and the existence of the tribe and the enrolled membership in the tribe would be abolished. In real life, Erdrich's grandfather was a part of the fight against this legislation, and in fact traveled to Washington to testify. And that character in the novel is the night watchman. He's somebody who works as a night watchman in a factory. So this was the bill, Bill 108 in 1953, calling for the termination of federal supervision over the Chippewa and other tribes, the disposition of federally owned property, relocation, and termination of federal services because of their status as Indian. So if we abolish tribal identities, then we no longer need to perform any funding. You can assimilate into the economy now, you're perfectly fine, which was, of course, blatantly untrue. So here's a quote from the novel about this proposed bureaucratic language. There it was in the line of the dry first sentence, the word termination. The author of the proposal had constructed a cloud of lofty words around this bill: emancipation, freedom, equality, success, that disguised its truth. Termination. Termination, missing only the prefix, the X. And when you consider that the death camps were only liberated in 1945, and this is taking place in 1953, extermination is quite ominous. So the bill is presented as, we're going to emancipate you from this status as a tribe, and you're going to have equality and success. But that language is a kind of smokescreen around this. Well, the characters are Thomas, who's the night watchman, the leader of the fight against the bill, and the character based on Erdrich's grandfather. The main character, whose eyes we see the action through, is named Pixie. She prefers to be called Patrice. She's Thomas's 19-year-old niece. Patrice has a sister who's gone to greater opportunity in the city, the Twin Cities, and has disappeared. We'll talk more about that in a moment. Arthur B. Watkins is the actual Utah senator who wrote this legislation. That's a historical figure. And then one of the wonderful things about this novel, which makes me recommend it so highly if you haven't read it, is the ghosts, the dogs, the horses, the trees, the grass, the skies, everything in this novel is pulsing with life. You get inside the mind of a hibernating bear. You get inside the grass. Everything is just pulsing with life. So one of the main themes is that theme of, assimilation. Senator Watkins wants Indians to assimilate into cities and the self-supporting economy, and no longer have to be supported by the government. You should assimilate, you should become part of American life. And there are also a couple of Mormon missionaries who float through the novel, and they express the belief that if Indians convert to Mormonism, then gradually their skin will lighten and they'll become more white. Vera, Pixie or Patrice's sister, represents missing and murdered Native women. You've probably heard a lot in recent years about the ongoing problem of missing Indigenous women, women who move to cities or who, for that matter, disappear off of reservations and other homes and are never heard from again. That was a problem even in the 1950s. It has certainly a strong echo with that continuing phenomenon today. One of the characters says, you can't assimilate Indian ghosts. In other words, even if we assimilate into urban centers, what about our ancestors who were on this land? What about them? One person trying to persuade them says, you get to be regular Americans. And Thomas answers that. Thomas, who's the night watchman, who's the one who's going to lead the fight against this, Thomas says in response to that, you get to be regular Americans. Well, closing in on 5 centuries, said Thomas, holding out through every kind of business your folks could throw our way. Holding out why? Because we can't just turn into regular Americans. We can look like it sometimes, act like it sometimes, but inside we are not. We're Indians. So the outward transformation would not effectuate an inward transformation. The intersection between land and identity is another major theme here. The idea that if you remove us from our land, if we're dislocated or we're displaced, then there's a loss of identity, an erasure of that because the connection is severed to the place where that identity is rooted. So in one conversation, Thomas was trying to explain this to another tribe member, and Thomas says, by law, you wouldn't be an Indian. And the man says, law can't take the Indian out of me. Another character says, we lose our young people, the cities swallow them. And then this last quote on this page is a wonderful character named Juggy Blue, who is a kind of behind the scenes woman who helps all these meetings to resist the legislation go forward. She cooks for the people. She does all these. She doesn't want to be testifying before Congress, but she's just kind of behind the scenes. But she speaks so beautifully. She says, we don't want to leave our land. We are poor, but even poor people can love their land. A character named Wood Mountain, who's a high school life. You can tell from that great name, Wood Mountain, is born with a sense of connection to place. And he has an eloquent moment in which he reflects, us being connected here so far back gives me a peaceful feeling. Sometimes when I'm out and around, I feel like they're with me, those way back people. I never talk about it, but they're all around us. I could never leave this place, right? So if they were forced to leave that land, assimilate to the city, then how would he maintain that connection to all those way back people, to the ancestors who are all rooted to this place? And so is he. It's even in his name. Now, as you know, treaties promise that land as long as the grass grows and the river flows. Why was Senator Watkins and the United States government interested in getting Indians off this land and into cities? Because then that land would revert to the government and could be sold to mining companies, to logging companies, to other private industry, to oil companies, to exploit whatever natural resources were on that land. The Klamath, Oregon Indian tribe was one that was slated for termination or emancipation. And then all of that, it's wanted back for profit. And in fact, Indians were, in the language of bureaucracy, relieved of, depending on how you count the dates, 1.4 million and 2.5 million acres of land. Incidentally, this went on, in fact, from 1953 until 1968. Also, in terms of environmental justice, as a human rights violation, there's a lack of clean water. And as Thomas says at one point, when he's run out of gas for his car to even get to the job as a night watchman, he says, there weren't enough jobs. There wasn't enough land. There wasn't enough farmable land. There weren't enough deer in the woods or ducks in the sloughs. and the game warden caught you if anything. The gas tank was empty, literally and physically. So the idea that Indians could move into the city and no longer needed government support because they were so economically self-sufficient, as Senator Watkins claimed, was obviously nonsense. I will say one of the things that's so remarkable about this novel, too, is the physicality of the descriptions. I have never read descriptions of cold that made me feel as cold as these descriptions of a Minnesota winter. Now, of course, I was fortunate I grew up in Los Angeles. I haven't been exposed to that kind of cold early in my life, but the descriptions of it are the descriptions of hunger, of what it's like to have nothing but a bit of fried dough and some bear grease spread on it for your meal are remarkable. And yet Erdrich does it in a way that's totally lacking in any self-pity. It's just a description of the way things are, and very vivid and beautifully written in that regard. Then language itself is a theme, as I'm already suggesting to you by drawing attention to names like Wood Mountain. And one of the characters says, things started going wrong when places everywhere were named for people, political figures, priests, explorers, and not for the real things that happened in those places. The dreaming, the eating, the death, the appearance of animals. The animals didn't come around to these locations stained by the names of humans. So already, once you start to sever the connection between land and its history, and replace it with names European explorers, political figures, and so enshrined in language, but can also be taken away by language. Those words like emancipation and freedom are smoke, one of the characters says. They're dressing it up as this wonderful thing, but in fact, what it means is the termination of our existence. Identity is tied to names. I already mentioned there's a character named Wood Mountain. Pixie wants to be called Patrice. When she makes another journey and has to disguise herself, she goes by the name Doris. And then she, in the city, falls into a role of something called a water jack. And I won't spoil it for you, but I will say that I agree with a New York Times review comment that said, after you've read this novel, you'll never forget the word water jack. And then there's an elder, a woman named Jeannette, who refuses to adopt an anglicized name and refuses to speak English. You can understand it, but she speaks only a native language, and she's an interesting character in the novel. When the tribe gathers to hear the House bill read aloud, the Emancipation Bill, the words tapped like dry little hammers. Isn't that a great description? And Thomas describes the words flattening him. So there's the power of language. Now, here's what actually happened. Because of the fight of Erdrich's grandfather and others, the Chippewa or Ojibwe tribe was in fact not terminated. They managed to stop that from happening. But 113 other tribal nations were in fact terminated, lost between, as I mentioned earlier, 1.4 million and 2.5 million acres of land. 31 tribal nations became totally landless. 24 became extinct. They never came back. The Klamath Termination Act of 1954 did, in fact, disestablish the tribe and its lands. They were restored in 1986 with tribal status, but their land was not. The Klamath Forest no longer belongs to them. Ultimately, between 1968, when this act was rescinded, and now 78 of the 113 terminated tribes gained federal recognition. Unless we think this is some relic of the 1950s and 1960s, a couple of recent cases. In in 2020, the Wampanoag Tribe's reservation in Cape Cod was disestablished by the government and its land taken out of federal trust. Why? Because they wanted to build a tribal casino, and nearby, a private company wanted to open its own casino in Rhode Island, a company that was funded by close friends of a high-ranking president at the time. And so they managed to get that tribe disestablished. If it didn't exist as a tribe, it couldn't open a tribal casino, and that opened the door for private interest to establish its own without competition. Also, there was a case last year, just resolved, in fact, by the Supreme Court this past June, which challenged the Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978. That act provided for an orphan to be offered to extended family members of a tribe first, and then to the tribe as a whole if there were no parents available. Actually, other members of the family, then extended family, then the tribe. And a Caucasian couple who wanted to adopt a Native American baby challenged the law and said that this Indian Child Welfare Act, which was meant to prevent Native American children from being whisked out of their families and educated in white boarding schools and so on, the Supreme Court ultimately ruled that the Child Welfare Act could remain in, and that tribes are sovereign nations. If the court had ruled the other way, that the tribes were racial groups, then the act would have been overruled and there would have been no protection for Native American children. So just so we're aware, challenges to sovereignty and land continue to go on in the present. A couple of last things on language. In the afterword, Louise Erdrich writes, lastly, if you shatter spirits and demolish lives, let this book erase that doubt. A good warning to us not to assume that bureaucratic, dry language is harmless. But then she also says, conversely, if you should be of the conviction that we are powerless to change those dry words, let this book give you heart. A great tribute to language and the ability to use language to defend human rights, to recognize violations of human rights within dry language, and to use language to act against it. All right. And now I want to move to experiments beyond traditional form. Erdrich herself is already stretching the bounds of the novel and taking us inside, for example, the mind of a hibernating bear. We've talked about the shifts in perspective in the Cisneros story, and that also moves back and forth between English and Spanish. So they're already doing experimental. I'll talk about the British Herbert poem, Easter Wings, which, as you can see, is shaped and positioned on the page to look like a pair of wings. And then if we flip the poem sideways from the way it was printed, right side up in the way we read it. The shape of he lost the same, so there's a loss, and that line is slightly shorter, decaying more and more, and then that line reflects that decay by being shorter till he became most poor, and most poor is the shortest line. Then it starts building back up with thee. So I'm reduced to the point where it's just me and God. Oh, let me rise. And oh, let me rise starts to spread out to a longer line as larks harmoniously Sing this day thy victories, then shall the fall further the flight in me. And as we get to further the flight in me, the line reaches maximum length, the wing is fully expanded. And you have a similar thing going on in the second stanza in the center, most thin with thee, and so on. So this is what's called a concrete poem, where the shape of the poem mirrors the message of the poem. And writers have been doing this for a long time. Here's the French poet Guillaume Apollinaire's poem, Il pleut, the rain, and you can see that the words are arranged to look like rainfall. Here's another one by Apollinaire, necktie and pocket watch, and you can see the words are arranged to look like a cravat and a pocket watch. Here's one by a German poet, Apple. And then he did this wonderful variation, apple with worm. See the little worm inside. Disintegration. And this reminds me, I saw a poem printed somewhere after 9/11. I can't remember. I couldn't find it, but it sort of showed the towers, the twin towers made out of words, with words coming off the side. Here's a brilliant one, I think, Swan and Shadow, where the top half of the poem, you see the shape of a swan and the words are describing it. And that long line in the center is the water line, and below it, the reflection in the water of the swan. So again, a concrete poem, the shape of the words reflecting the meaning. This is one of my favorites by Dorothy Charles, Concrete Cat. So you see stripe, 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 paw, paw, down in the bottom right, litter box, an upturned mouse on the far lower right, dish, dish down at the bottom. So sometimes these are very clever. Sort of bridging the gap between purely concrete poems and poems that address a human rights issue is this poem, Bomb, by Gregory Corso, which was in his collection, The Happy Day of Death. And if you find a copy of that book, you'll see that this poem folds out to 2 or 3 pages, and it's in the shape of an atomic mushroom cloud. So again, writers forced by sometimes extreme circumstances, such as the threat of death by atomic bomb, to experiment with new forms. And in our own time, that's also taken shape in the form of what are now called graphic novels. So when Art Spiegelman first came out with Maus, nobody knew what to call it. He referred to it as comics, C-O-M-M-I-X, a mix of comics and history. And it's telling the tale of the Jews and Nazis in Nazi Germany, with the Jews as mice and the Nazis as cats. Well, at the time, because graphic novels were not a genre yet, a lot of people were very deeply offended. They thought that he was trivializing the subject. And in fact, when this appeared in the New York Times bestseller list, the first volume, they put it under the category of fiction. And Art Spiegelman wrote to them and he said, "What do you mean fiction? You're a bunch of Holocaust deniers. Everything in here is true. It really happened." The next week, it appeared in the New York Times bestseller list under the nonfiction category. Of course, at first they thought, well, it's a comic book. It can't possibly be nonfiction. Which shows you the fluidity of these things, but also the originality of what Spiegelman did. In fact, the Pulitzer Prize Committee wanted to give him a prize, but they couldn't think of an existing category, so they gave him a Pulitzer Prize in special category, because there was no such thing yet. Here's an example of the sorts of things that that Spiegelman said were the truth. Here was a kind of blueprint of his father's hiding space that saved his life. That's one of the pages of Maus. And then sometimes he found ways to express things that you really couldn't do, perhaps, if it were a traditional memoir or a biography of his father. On the left panel, you see Spiegelman's father and his wife trying to escape, and you see how the road looks kind of like a swastika, visually suggesting there's nowhere that they can go where they're not somehow at the mercy of Nazi control. So the visual as well as a narrative exploration. Now, Spiegelman went on and did a book called In the Shadow of No Towers, which was about 9/11, but his work has inspired many other writers and artists who come from very different kinds of backgrounds, very different political situations, to express their thoughts. So Joe Sacco's Palestine is one. So, taking a very different kind of situation and using the same technique to express that. Joe Sacco also did Safe Area Goraja about the Bosnian War. You may be familiar with Marjane Satrapi's Persepolis, which was made into a kind of animated film. Here's some scenes from, so you see a very, very different kind of artistic style from Spiegelman's, and in a completely different culture, about a young woman growing up in Iran in the Islamic Revolution and then being sent to Paris and then coming back. Very different subject matter, but using that original ground. There's her depiction of what happened to a family member who was deemed an enemy of the revolution. This has continued to spread. Here's Alison Bechdel's Fun Home, about her traumatic upbringing and development of her gender identity. Gaylord Phoenix by Edie Fake. And the #1 most challenged book of 2021, and I'm sure when we get the figures for last year will be as well, Genderqueer. All different kinds of graphic novels. Last thing I want to take you to, just take a few more minutes, is a work by Linda Elia called Notre Combat, which means our struggle. Linda Elia was raised in Tunisia, and her family left there when she was about 8 because of state-sponsored anti-Semitism. They're Jewish. She moved to Paris, grew up in Paris, developed a career as a photographer and an artist. And then one day, her daughter brought home a copy of Hitler's Mein Kampf that she had picked up at a playmate's house. It was sitting on a table. And so Mein Kampf means my struggle. And since this happened in Paris, the book was the French title of Mein Kampf, or My Struggle, Mon Combat, my struggle. Well, you can see that Linda Elia has taken that and she's changed it to Notre, from Hitler's individual struggle to our collective struggle. So if your child brought home a copy of Mein Kampf that they'd picked up at a playmate's house, what would you do with it? Would you throw it in the trash, ignore it, say nothing, try to talk about it, try to talk about it with your child, try to go to the parents of the child in whose house you found it, talk about it with them, burn it? No, we're not supposed to burn books. That's what the Nazis did. What are we going to do with this book? Well, what Linda Elia did was she started experimenting with the pages because she was an artist herself. So like you can see wrapping this one in wire. And she started doing different things. And then she started taking out the pages and sending them to other people, not just artists, people from all around the world, all different countries, saying, here's a page from Mein Kampf, Mon Combat. Do something with it. Collage, paint over it, draw on it, just do something. And she got to people from all walks of life from all over the world. So I'm just going to show you a few of these pages. Here's one. You can see all the words are scribbled out, except there in the center right, 2 words. I'm not sure if you can read them. Destruction and Juiv, destruction and Jews. And at the top, somebody has written very movingly, "A maman," to my mother. Some people chose to use humor. Hitler is Pinocchio. The text of Mein Kampf taken and put on a toilet paper roll. Here's one that shows the connection between what we would now call hate speech and actual death. So you have a block of the text being shoved into a human head that's like a meat grinder, and then coming out the other end, corpses. Here's one that looks cheerful at first, all these bright colors, until you realize that this little girl is holding Nazi flags and is dancing over the eviscerated corpse of a dead person. And there's an adult hand coming down and holding her left hand, so presumably the supervising and maybe even approving adult. Some of these speak for themselves. I'm just going to scroll through the next few without comment. And now we start to turn to some where the words are still there, but there's still the children of today and their ability to create beauty. Here they're treating this like it's some kind of billboard and spray painting beautiful colors over it. The big balloon heart floating, flowers growing up. And then this image, like memorial candles, in which you can still see the words of the text inside them, which I think does a couple of things. One is it creates a question for us. How fragile are these lights? If we don't tend them, can they go out and be extinguished and leave us in complete darkness? Or can we continue to cultivate them? It's not saying those words never existed. They're still there. They're still visible. But yet we're capable of creating a world in which we memorialize them and restore beauty. And so I think that's where I want to end. I see we're at 6:52. I'm going to stop sharing and take your questions. Thank you for listening.
And thank you, Richard. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Good. Rose has asked a question and says, hi, truly understand Hitler was absolutely evil at some point, though. I am now curious what Mein Kampf was about. Is it bad from a human perspective to read about what was very evil?
Well, that's a great question, Rose. So I guess I'll start by saying just my personal view. I've done a lot of teaching about and writing about the Holocaust. I've never been able to bring myself to read Mein Kampf. I don't want to buy a copy. I don't want to check a copy out of the library, but I do think it's important to read about evil, and that it's possible to do that without reading that particular book. I mean, and if I were a historian rather than a literary person, I would probably feel differently about it. I think it's necessary to read about evil, although it's hard, because if we simply say, this person was pure evil or this person was a monster, then it makes it easier to dismiss him, to say, well, he was an aberration, he was a monster. We don't have to worry about that kind of thing happening. If we start to understand in ways that literature can sometimes help us do by taking us inside the minds of characters who we otherwise have no access to, then maybe we can understand in a way that helps us to recognize and prevent. And literature can can take us to those places. But I would also say, if you're reading about evil, exercise some self-care, pace yourself, put it down when you need to, walk away when you need to. Some of these things are extremely hard to read, but I think it's important when we read them not to use words like inhuman or inhumane, because those suggest that what people have done, what perpetrators have done, is somehow outside of humanity. And in fact, it's within humanity. They're things that humans do. And that's why I think it is important to read about them to whatever level you're able to tolerate them. But then it's also important to read stories of rescuers and people who are inspirational and people who have acted towards human rights. I hope that helps.
Thank you. An anonymous attendee says, I get that it is a hard question. Understand your perspective. Will not be on my reading list. More wanted to ask the question, to think about it and address it. And I want to ask, or not a question as much as it is kind of a comment, but I think so many things that you have shared tonight and those books are addressing something that is so real right now, except it's real in social media and in our printed words, you know, in the newspapers and from mouth to mouth. And I am concerned that a lot of the people that are spreading some of that kind of stuff are not reading literature. They come to the public with a attitude that was handed to them or told to them or something. I don't know, just a thought. And wanted to share my concern with those kinds of things. But I too want to return to some of these books that I have not read. Another comment is that someone else's, you have made it clear the power of literature to inspire empathy. In light of recent book bans and attacks on libraries, particularly school libraries, how should literature respond? How can we continue to promote empathy if literature itself is being challenged and censored?
Well, that's a great question. And the American Library Association on its website has a lot of great resources for how to respond. If one looks at the books that are selected for being banned, you'll notice a disproportionate number of those books are by writers of color or writers who are expressing gender identity that is other than a binary heterosexual identity. So the attack on these books is not only an attack on literature, often by people who, by their own confession, have not read the books themselves that they're advocating for, but is an attack on the personhood, the identity, the right to exist of the authors of those books and the communities that are connected with those authors. So it's very much a human rights issue. And, but, you know, we have here close to where I am an attempt to get a book on the ballot that would, get a measure on the ballot that would actually shut down a local rural library because efforts to get that library to remove books from its shelves were unsuccessful. So now they're just going to try to shut down the library itself. And this is not the only place where that's happening. I would look at the American Library Association website for ways to resist this. I would also say, show up at your local school board meetings, city council meetings. Don't let the loudest voices in the room be the voices that carry the day. Someone has to push back. And I think the question is so brilliant because it's exactly a lack of empathy for other people that is behind this banning, a lack of empathy for their humanity, which they themselves, the banners themselves might attain if they actually read these books. And it's the gift that literature can give us that by banning, not only are they saying, I don't want my child to read this, but if these things are out of the curriculum and off the shelves, then they're stopping everybody else's children from reading them too. And so, you know, this work of banning, which has been going on for many decades, is being done at a grassroots level, at school board meetings, city council meetings. Show up and provide a counter voice.
Those are really good ideas and respond to things that I personally would have been thinking about too. I think the subject is really heavy, and I think it's very important, but I have no other questions. I appreciate your referring us to the American Library Association for ideas on how to respond to the book banning, for instance, and the lack of empathy. This is about people not reading the books and therefore not picking up any of that kind of encouragement or guidance or background.
Yeah, and of course, you know, studying the humanities is no guarantee that a person is going to become humane.
Right.
But it's I think the best way that we have access to the hearts, thoughts, and minds of people who we would never have that for otherwise, including people whose behaviors baffle us, and so can take us inside all those things.
That's heavy. It is. I have another comment from Marcy.
Sure.
She says, I appreciate
Yes.
your point of view and this presentation. As tribes are being terminated, books banned, and critical race theory is banned from being taught in schools, our population is continually being dumbed down, as well as discrimination and hate flourishing. Thank you for bringing this to our community.
Well, thank you for connecting those different things. I think that, you know, you pointed to a really essential connection, which together those things constitute a kind of indoctrination or limitation of exposure to ideas other than what the people initiating these bans want, which would be then indoctrination rather than education, and to my mind is antithetical to everything that a liberal arts education, for that matter, any kind of real education would contain.
I agree. And I think you have reminded us to be concerned about this at a current level. But we can learn about it, about the history, of course, through these books. But thank you for bringing it out.
You're welcome. So these are some things I'd ask us all to think about as we go forward. We may not be able to have the impact of Louise Erdrich. We may not be able to address all the human rights violations in the world, but somewhere in your community, there's an opportunity. The fact that we can't do everything, the fact that we can't change the whole world doesn't mean we shouldn't try to do anything. And so thinking at the local level, and here are just a couple of takeaways for us that recognizing others as deserving of human rights means we have to see them as human first before we think about human rights for them, and our sense of that is always evolving, and we're in a period of backlash now, but for many of us it's expanding. Seeing others as human might require a leap of empathy, depending on how our society is depicting people. Literature helps us make that empathetic leap by taking us inside the minds and hearts of people who are different from us, or who just baffle us. And that empathy really provides the basis for human rights, because human rights are not extended to people who we don't see as human. And it's terrible in some ways to say extended to, because of course the meaning of human rights is these are rights that inhere in us simply by virtue of our being human. It's not like voting right or driving right, where there's where a government can determine should that happen at 16, at 18, at 21. Human rights inhere in us simply by virtue of our being human. So it shouldn't really make sense to say extended to, but in reality, there are power structures that preserve and limit these. And I think that human rights work and literature both help us achieve empathy and recognize the presence of evil, recognize suffering, but as in that beautiful image of the children painting or the memorial candles, to also not be prevented from introducing beauty and love into the world, even alongside recognition of the presence of evil.
I like that. I appreciate that a lot. I have two other quick questions. Do you have a favorite young adult author who writes about empathy?
I don't know as much about young adult literature as I should. I'm happy to share a reading list with you, but it's not going to have a lot of YA literature on it. I'm sorry, I don't.
All right. And then that brings me to the question that I wanted to ask about one of your publications that I mentioned in your introduction, using literature to teach peace. We all need that. Is that available?
Yes, it is. What if I send you a PDF and you send it out to the registered people? Will that work?
I would like that. And yes, I think we can do that. So
okay.
You know how to find me. So yes, if you would send that, we could pass that on, because I think that's kind of a simplified version of what we've been talking about tonight, and in terms of teaching peace. That is what it is.
Yes.
Through
Absolutely.
empathy and understanding and all of those things. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thanks.
For your experience.
Thanks, Dorothy and Elizabeth. Thanks to Southwest Seattle Historical Society. Thanks to Humanities Washington. Thanks to everybody for joining and listening. It's been a pleasure to talk with you. And great questions.
Wow, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. Thank you, Dorothy. Thank you again, everybody, for attending. We will send out the recommended reading list, if you don't mind sharing that too, Richard, to everybody who is attending here tonight. And we appreciate your time and your studies and your passion for this subject. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And good night to you too, Elizabeth. Thank you, Richard. And good night.
Okay. Good night, everybody. Thank you.